Good evening and a very warm welcome to this, another in our wonderful series of academic lectures for all of our alumni from our wonderful fellows. And I have a wonderful new fellow to introduce to you this evening. My name is Eilish Angelini. I'm the principal of the college for those of you who haven't met me yet. And those who haven't met me yet, I do hope that you'll be able to get back to college, not just in this context, but in real life when it is at this particular period absolutely glorious looking outside and the gardens are at their very best and our students are still at their very best because they have exams coming up. So there are times which I'm sure many of you remember, probably not with the greatest of affection before the exams, but nonetheless, I hope that your memories here have been very happy. We have had a fabulous series of lectures and tonight is no less than that. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr Amanda Smyth, who joined St Hugh's in October of 2020 as a Mary R. Emerson Career Development Fellow in Engineering Science. Dr Smyth's position is generally supported by alumna Dr Rebecca Emerson, who came up to study economics here in 1993, who has been a tremendous support to this college and a member of our investment committee, as well as a benefactor. And we're deeply grateful to her for her generosity in supporting this role and in particular promoting women in engineering through the crucial outreach work that Dr Smyth is conducting. Dr Smyth is also a lecturer in the Department of Engineering Science at the University of Oxford. She graduated with a Master's in Engineering and Mechanical Engineering from Imperial College London in 2016 and completed her PhD in the Whittle Laboratory of the University of Cambridge. Her research centres on unsteady fluid dynamics, primarily as applied to the hydrodynamics of tidal stream turbines. Now, normally I would not make the slightest pretense of having a clue about what that's about, but I had the great pleasure of interviewing her, and she is a wonderful teacher and was able to allow me to understand it. And I'm sure you're going to be absolutely fascinated by what she has to say this evening. We've been sent lots of questions for Dr Smyth ahead of today's event, and I'm sure many more will come through via the Q&A box during the webinar. I know that Dr Smyth will try to get as many of those answered as possible, but I must apologise in advance as we do not manage to answer all of your questions probably, and we might be able to get back to you at a later stage with those answers. Before I hand over to Dr Smyth for what I know will be a fabulous lecture, the road to net zero, the role of offshore renewable energy, I'd like to take this opportunity again to thank those of our alumni who are listening, who so generously have donated to the college's COVID-19 support fund for students when booking for this lecture. Your generosity and support, as usual from our alumni, is very much appreciated in these very challenging times. And in particular, before I depart, I just want to wish you and your families the very best of health. And for those of you who've been affected adversely by it in any shape or form, again, our sympathy is with you and your families. And please do not hesitate to call on us for support should that be required. Thank you very much. And now I will hand over to Dr Smyth.
Thank you so much, Principal. That was a really nice introduction. Let me just share my screen with you all, and do let me know if there's any issues with connectivity or with the sound or anything like that. Right, so I hope that I'm sharing and I hope that you can now see my screen. Right, there we go. So yes, as Eilish was mentioning, I'm going to talk on the road to net zero, the role of offshore renewable energy. I'm going to be focusing primarily on the technology underlying it. So obviously there's a lot of facets to this particular issue, and I'm going to focus on the technology aspects of it and how the existing and under development offshore renewable technologies can contribute to the overall net zero carbon production in the UK. Because I wanted this talk to be quite general, I acquired some help from one of my colleagues, Dr. Chris Vogel, who is the resident expert on wind turbine resource prediction. So he has been contributing a bit to this presentation. So I just wanted to say thank you so much to him for that help. Oh, hang on. How do I change the slides? There we go. Yes. So just to start off with, this is a picture from the website of the Supergen Offshore Renewable Energy Hub. which is a consortium that was set up in 2001 by the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council. And its goal was to deliver sustained and coordinated research on sustainable power generation and supply. So basically, they fund and coordinate targeted research into offshore renewable energy. So it is like a big priority for the government, and that's from partly, just in that sense. And this picture is from what they call the research landscape. And if you go to their website, you can find this research landscape. You can click on all the various parts of the thing. You can read more about research, about grid connectivity, energy storage. There's tons of information there. But I just put this up to show that I'm going to focus on the three sort of main sources of offshore renewable energy power extraction technologies, which is wind power, tidal power, and wave power. That's what I'll be focusing on today. So just so everyone knows what we're talking about, this is a wind power. This is a wind farm. This is Hornsea 1, the largest offshore wind farm in the world, with a capacity of 1.2 gigawatts, which is enough to power over 1 million homes. And of course, wind energy is by far the most mature technology out of the three. Then we have tidal energy, which is something that people tend to be less familiar with. But the simplest way to really explain it is you can basically think of tidal turbines as wind turbines, but they operate underwater. The actual technology of energy extraction tends to be exactly the same. And that's why they often look very similar in shape. So this is an example of a fairly large scale tidal turbine. It's 18 meters in diameter, rated at 1 megawatts. And this is a sort of a large scale industrial prototype. And so in this particular case, instead of having the wind generate the power, you have the movement, flow movement through the tides is moving through and powering the turbine. But other than that, it's very similar to a wind turbine. And then, of course, we have wave energy, which, so here is a picture of a wave energy device. It's much more difficult to find a representative picture of a wave energy device because there are so many different kinds, and I'll go into that a bit later. But here's an example of a sort of 0.75 megawatts rated wave power device. That's also a prototype being tested in the test site in Scotland. So why talk about offshore renewable energy? Well, so primarily the UK is investing in this because the UK has a huge offshore renewable energy resource. The UK is pretty much one of the windiest countries in Europe. I've read an estimate somewhere that it's sort of 40% of all the wind in Europe goes through the UK. So I mean, that's quite a lot. It also has an estimated 50% of the European tidal power resource. So basically the UK is investing in this because it's a natural resource for the UK, and the UK has a lot of it. Some numbers, it's been estimated that offshore wind has the potential to deploy over 40 gigawatts by 2030, which is pretty soon. That would be enough to power all the homes in the UK. Tidal, sort of conservative estimates say that we could deploy up to 27 gigawatts by 2050. Wave, again, sort of practical estimates would say that you could deploy maybe 22 gigawatts by 2050 if we invested in the infrastructure. But to do this would require a lot of industry development. So at the moment, offshore wind is has 8.5 gigawatts installed capacity. Tidal only has 10 megawatts of installed capacity, but sites are leased for up to 1.2 gigawatts. There's some encouraging development there. Wave power, on the other hand, in 2014 had 4 megawatts installed, but then 2018 that had dropped to less than 1 megawatt. So it's not necessarily going in the right direction. In the UK at the moment, the goal is to reach 40 gigawatts of installed capacity by 2030, and that would require an upscale of something like 470% in offshore wind. So there is a huge upscale that's required to meet the current targets. So that the resource is there, but there's going to be a lot of investment and a lot of work in order to get there. So what I was going to talk about is basically what from a technology perspective, what does it take to scale up, in particular wind power, to those levels of production? What engineering challenges are associated, and what are the consequences for energy security. And then I'm also going to talk about what might be the role of these smaller offshore renewables like tidal and wave, in order to sort of also contribute to this overall net zero goal. So I just want to go through quickly some things that I'm not going to talk about, sadly. As I said, there's so many aspects of this, but that I don't have time to talk about today, and that also is not necessarily my area of expertise. Energy storage and grid connectivity is often brought up as an issue with sort of when intermittent renewable energy comes up, and those are real issues and those are actively being researched, but I'm not going to mention them too much today. There's also a lot of people talking, you can talk about the environmental impact of offshore structures, and that is also a real sort of problem that that is being researched, but again, not going to be my focus today. There's other things, sort of logistics, infrastructure, sort of government policy, things like that. But those that's not going to be my focus today. My focus today is going to be primarily on the technology of energy extraction itself. So it's going to start off by talking about wind energy. So at the moment, wind energy the plan is that wind energy will sort of be one of the primary means of reaching energy net zero in the UK. That's according to the government's plan. At the moment, there are about sort of just over 8,000 onshore wind turbines installed in the UK and just over 2,000 offshore turbines. So there's a lot more onshore turbines, about 4 times as many. But offshore wind turbines is currently producing half of the wind power in the UK. So basically, offshore is giving, you get a lot more power per turbine offshore. So that's a real positive. And the reason for why offshore wind turbines give more power or why you want to go offshore with a wind turbine is that the winds are much more consistent. They're also much stronger winds. And that's actually really important because the power you get from the wind scales with the wind velocity to the power of 3. So if you double the wind velocity, you get 8 times as much power. So if to increase the velocity it makes a big difference to power production. The wind is also less intermittent. You can build much larger turbines because it's not as intrusive to communities and things like that. So all of these are good reasons for why it's a worthwhile investment to go offshore. So this map here is the current installed wind farms, both onshore and offshore in the UK. And this map here shows the offshore wind farms that are currently planned for construction. So this is showing wind farms all the way from fully commissioned wind farms, which is the dark blue dots, all the way to, and then also just farms that are simply in the early planning stages, but are sort of on track to being completed. So this is, so there's 39 new offshore projects that are currently ongoing, which would, should they all be realized, that would represent roughly a 400% increase in the number of offshore turbines. And if this all happened, that would actually reach the target of 40 gigawatts installed capacity by 2030. So far on track to meet target. Interesting point to note is that a typical wind turbine lifetime is about 25 years. So if we want to think about, we often think about sort of 2030 is great, but we think about 2050 timescale, we're actually going to have to build the same number of turbines all over again because all the turbines that are currently in production will have reached end of life. So there's a lot of turbines that's going to have to be built. So we're just going to talk a little bit about what the technological challenges are of such a sort of significant upscale in the wind turbine use and production. So in terms of implementation of renewable energies and new types of energy, cost is basically the main driver for whether a source of renewable energy it can be implemented large scale. And the problem then with going offshore is that building things offshore is really expensive. So even though you get more energy yield per turbine, building the turbines themselves becomes extremely expensive. Some issues include sort of just building anything underwater. It's hugely complicated. It's much harder to access the turbines for maintenance. You need to think of issues like storms, survivability of the turbines in sort of very harsh weather conditions. And actually one of the primary costs is actually power cables. If you build very far offshore, which you might want to do because that's where the strongest winds are, you might end up with a really large expense in trying to transport that to get that energy back to the mainland. So this picture here shows a little bit of how the levelized cost of energy has developed over a few years and how it compares to, I mean, often nuclear is like the one we sort of compare to when we think about the cost of energy. And encouragingly, like a while back, so this first graph here is that's offshore wind. A while back, that was sort of deemed quite expensive compared to most other options, but the prediction of how much it's going to cost has actually gone down quite substantially lately. And part of that is just because of implementation. Like the more you actually implement the technology, the more of a large scale sort of economy of scale situation you get, where the more infrastructure there is, the cheaper it is to produce the energy. So now it actually is predicted to be cost competitive, but it's still more expensive than onshore wind, because onshore wind you don't have to build anything underwater. So that's encouraging in terms of the cost of energy. There is some issues still about whether offshore turbines are going to be sort of long-term survivable, because of course offshore conditions are much more harsh. So there's still sort of inherent risk there. That's sort of time will tell what will actually happen. But price-wise and comparing to other sources of energy, it is still very encouraging. One limitation of offshore energy is sea depths. So at the moment, I mean, in the UK, we were actually quite fortunate because, as you can see in this on this picture here, the sea depths around the UK are actually comparatively shallow, which is good because that means that you have a lot of potential sites for offshore building. Because conventional offshore turbines, you can only build up to about 60 meters depth. So for UK, that's good. There's quite a few sort of localized areas of shallow seas that are sort of potential for building. But if you look at, it's far from everywhere. There's quite a lot of very deep sea areas around the UK where you couldn't build a conventional turbine. And in Southern Europe, you have potential. If you look at sort of Spain and Portugal, for example, they do have the resource, but the seas are just way too deep for it to really be a practical thing to implement. So, again, this is why the UK is in a good position to develop wind energy. But the fact that we can't build in deep seas is a problem for sort of, if we do want to scale up and actually rely on wind, because we're missing potential sort of high-speed wind resource because they're too far out and too far into deep seas. So one of the technologies that has been developed and is currently sort of hailed as the sort of key technology to enable certainly sort of more sort of international widespread implementation of wind power is the floating platform wind turbine. So in the UK, this is also hailed as sort of, this is the future of wind turbines. Also in the UK, even though we have quite shallow seas, it's still going to be a benefit in terms of accessibility of the resource. So floating, so yeah, of course, conventional turbines, which you can see examples of here to the left, they will be mounted directly onto the seafloor on a rigid foundation. But then if you have these floating platform innovations, you can just have, you put your turbine on a floating platform of various shapes and you just tether them to the ocean floor. And this is actually similar to how oil rigs are built and mounted to the even though that it's in very deep waters. And this actually increases the sort of the water depth accessibility to something like 300 meters. And that would be kind of a step change, sort of a game changer in terms of energy accessibility. That would enable wind turbine to be deployed in a much wider variety of sort of coastlines and sort of sea conditions. So that's seen as a key technology in terms of accessibility. But it is an untested technology. It's quite an early technology, and at the moment it's very expensive. But the expectation is that the more this technology is implemented, the more the cost will go down. So rather than a sort of technological problem, it's seen as kind of an implementation problem. When this starts to get implemented, the cost should go down. Of course, having a floating platform wind turbine does create additional technical challenges because the platform will move in response to things like waves, streams, storms, sort of gusty winds. The platform isn't completely rigid. And this can cause a problem with the wind turbines themselves, because if you imagine, this picture of this is a picture of a prototype floating platform turbine. And if you imagine this platform or this turbine moving back and forth, what happens is that this creates very large forces, or it creates forces on the turbine blades, and forces that sort of oscillate in time. And the problem with forces that oscillate in time is that if you have these repeated forces, even very small forces can cause damage and eventually destruction of the blade. Even more so than sort of if you have just a single large load that's constant in time, that it can be more damaging to a small load that happens over that oscillates over a long period of time. So that's potentially a problem for this type of turbine long term. It's called fatigue loading, and that limits the lifetime of the turbines. And a turbine with shorter lifetime will produce less power over its lifetime, and that will increase costs. But this is all sort of subjects of ongoing industrial research, and there's definitely indicators that these problems can be overcome. As I said, so these technical challenges will not hinder the implementation of these wind farms. There is still going to be this large-scale deployment. So the question is then, what is the consequences of this large-scale dependency on wind energy? And then we're starting to go into more of a question of the predictability and availability of energy. What does it look like for a country to depend on an intermittent renewable like wind for a long period of time? What's the consequences for energy security? Normally we start thinking about energy storage when we think about these things, and that is correct. Like, we should think about developing storage technologies for energy to increase security. But another thing we can do is diversification of the energy resource. And it turns out that if you increase the number of wind farms, you can actually increases the reliability of the energy system, but only if the different wind farms are not correlated to each other. So if your two wind farms are not producing energy or not producing energy at the same time, if they're uncorrelated, then you increase the diversity of your system, and so that increases security. So this graph here shows an example of how to increase the diversity of wind farms, because on the y-axis you have the correlation factor between wind farms, and on the x-axis you have distance between recording sites. And this is recorded for onshore wind farms, by the way, like actual physical data. And as you can see, the further away the further apart the farms are, the less correlated they are. So if we build a lot of farms and put them really far apart, we should be able to diversify the resource to the point where we increase the energy security. And we can do this in a little more detailed sense. So here's the picture that I showed earlier of all the planned wind farms in the UK, and they've been divided into regions 1 to 6. And then on the right-hand side, there's this little probability chart where you can follow one of these slides and see, okay, what is the probability of there being low wind speeds in region 2, given that there's also low wind speeds in one of the other regions? So, for example, the probability that there's low wind speeds in region 2, given that there's in region 2, the correlation is 1. But for example, region 2, which is this area here, just above the channel, the correlation between, if there's low wind speeds in region 2, there's a chance that there will be low wind speeds in region 2, given that there are also low wind speeds in region 5, which is up in Scotland, is very low. So the idea here is that the fact that these wind farms are so far apart is actually increasing energy security. On the other hand, you also have, obviously region 2 and 3 are very close to each other, and that's quite predictably, you end up with these very high correlation factors of sort of 0.7, 0.5, rather than sort of your low sort of 0.14, 0.2. And the interesting thing here is that this is not just that they're close to each other, but it also dependent on the prevalent weather systems that pass the UK. because there's a prevalent weather system that comes regularly to the UK that we know of, that creates regions of low wind speed, and that tends to move through the channel. So basically, there's sort of, it moves from north to south through the channel, areas of low wind speed. So you will have, we know because of the weather patterns that there will be long periods of time in this sort of space with low wind speeds. So that's something we can predict, and we can have a probabilistic model of sort of how likely it is that we'll have low wind speeds in any given time. So that's one way to sort of increase reliability. We can also start looking at the probabilities of UK-wide low wind speed events, and we can use that to estimate our need for sort of backup storage energy. So for this graph, let me just get this exactly right. So on the x-axis, you have basically the percentage of the UK that is experiencing low wind speeds simultaneously. So like here, sort of 80% of the UK is at the same time experiencing low wind speeds. And on the y-axis is how many hours of the year is the UK experiencing those low wind speeds. So for example, about 10 hours a year, 80% of the UK will all experience low wind speeds at once, and there won't be anywhere in those 80% of the UK that can produce wind energy. So obviously that's quite low because the UK is quite a windy country, but we can use this to estimate, okay, for example, there'll be 10% of the UK at the time, there'll be about 10% of the UK will at the same time have very large numbers of hours with low wind speeds. You could have even weeks at a time with very little wind. And then we can know that those 10% will somehow need to be covered by alternative energy generation or energy storage. So this is also, so statistics like this is how we can build a probabilistic model of whether we needed backup energy or not. But one of the main things that we might want to know is whether availability of the wind resource coincides with high energy demand. And the good news is that high speed wind events are much more prevalent during the winter. And that's a pretty good news for us, because that means that when the energy demand is high in the winter, that's also when the wind speeds are high. And that's what you can see in this graph here. The blue boxes, they represent capacity factor of wind farms. It's basically how much power is the wind farms producing. And the red line is the demand of electricity. As you can see, the demand is actually following the actual capacity of energy generated quite well. So at the moment, that's quite encouraging, that wind produces more power in the winter. Of course, a very interesting long-term consideration of this is actually climate change. So first of all, I already mentioned that weather systems have quite a big impact on how much power can be generated in the UK and what regions of the UK can generate power. Climate change may change those weather systems, which makes it more difficult for us to predict long-term what's going to happen. The other thing that might happen is that we might get increased energy demand during the summer because people start using air conditioning more. So all this adds a little bit of uncertainty of the sort of the wind energy resource, which will help to be dealt with somehow. But for now, the correlations are pretty good in terms of available energy with demand. Okay, so that was kind of a summary of some of the sort of ongoing research topics in wind power. There are a lot of other additional sort of technical challenges, a lot of really interesting challenges. Fatigue life, I already mentioned, how to predict that, how to account for that, how to increase reliability. Another very interesting aspect of wind power is the fact that you get these blade degradations over time because of sort of very small particle impacts on the tidal blades, which just completely erodes the blades, and that really reduces efficiency of the turbine blades, and that's really bad. You also get sort of ice build up on turbine blades sometimes, and you have to actually like get helicopters up and sort of wash off the blades, and that takes quite a lot of maintenance. Control of loads and power output is a big topic. We often want to increase the size of the turbines a lot, because that gives us more power, but that becomes like, is that even possible? And structurally, like with the materials, that's a really interesting research topic. And then of course, the dynamics of generating wind power in a wind farm, because of course, a freestanding wind turbine will produce more energy than a turbine that's right behind another turbine, which is what this figure here is showing quite neatly, where you can see very clearly that this turbine is the second turbine is standing in the wake of the upstream turbine, and that means that the second turbine produces a lot less energy. So how do we model that accurately? How do we use that in power prediction? So yeah, all of these are topics of ongoing research that makes this field really fascinating. But I do want to emphasize that all of these are they're not technical limitations for widespread implementation of wind power. And that's kind of the point. So because of that, what becomes a long-term issue is then more, okay, how do we ensure reliability of the resource? A system that is very reliant on intermittent renewables needs a lot of redundancy or backup fuels in order to sort of ensure energy security. In order to not rely on fossil fuels for backup energy, another offshore renewable could be a very suitable alternative as a renewable baseline energy, and that is tidal power, which is kind of my favorite topic because that's what I work with on a day-to-day basis. Is to show you this is sort of what tidal power looks like. This is, for example, it's a 20 meter diameter, 1 megawatts turbine that was developed by General Electric. So as I mentioned before, tidal turbines and wind turbines generate the sort of actual technology of energy extraction is actually exactly the same. But the difference between them is that the working fluid is water rather than air, because both air and water are fluids. The only difference there is the density. So for that reason, tidal turbines often look very similar to wind turbines, but we'll talk about some of the differences between the two in a moment. So why is tidal energy so interesting? Well, as opposed to the majority of other renewable energies, tides are completely predictable. So if you combine this predictability with storage, you can have a completely renewable and predictable baseload energy that you can use to complement intermittent renewables like wind. Because obviously tides don't flow all the time, so you do still need some sort of either storage or backup energy. But I just included this picture here as an example of why with tidal power you need less backup and less storage than you would for a wind turbine. So this is like an example of a sort of a power resource estimate for the island of Alderney. This blue line here is the estimate of the tidal resource for the island, and as you can see, it's really, really intermittent, just because we're seeing it over several days, because the tide goes in and out twice a day. So it's really intermittent, but it's extremely predictable. You know exactly how much you're going to get, and you only have these very short intervals when you don't have any energy. So if you have an energy storage system that can just cover these intervals, you can have a very robust. You only need a very small storage system, and you can have a very robust sort of system. For the red line predicts the wind resource of only this area, of only this particular island. And that's much more intermittent. So it has longer periods of high energy, but it also has longer periods of low energy. And so because of that, you would need more storage and you need more backup energy for the wind power. And so you'd actually end up with, in this particular study, they found that actually it was more expensive to have a wind turbine than to have a tidal turbine, because you just needed so much more backup. So that's why tidal could be a really valuable resource. So as I mentioned, the UK has one of the largest tidal resources in the world. Predicted sort of practically achievable energy is 27 gigawatts by 2050. But as I said, there's only 10 megawatts installed at the moment. So the question is, why is this industry struggling so much to take off? So that's what I'll talk a little bit about now. But before I do that, just quickly, I just want to make a distinction between tidal stream turbines and tidal barrages. So a lot of people, when we talk about tidal energy, they think about tidal barrages. This is sort of an artist illustration of what that would look like. And it looks a lot more like a dam, which basically means that you kind of trap the incoming tide and then release it again through a turbine. And there has been a few of those planned. There are a few exist around the world, but it is a huge infrastructure project. It costs a lot of money. It's very environmentally impactful on the local environment. And so it's a bit controversial, and there aren't really any projects planned in the UK at the moment. So that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about these tidal stream turbines, which are freestanding, sort of independent device, and look much more like a wind turbine. So there's a sure sign that the tidal industry is less mature than the wind industry, and that is that there are so many different kinds of tidal devices. So here are some examples. This is the most common kind. This is the horizontal axis tidal turbine. It looks a lot like a wind turbine. You also can get vertical axis tidal turbines. Again, very similar to equivalents in the wind industry. So those are probably the most common ones. Then you get some very out there interesting concepts like this, which is an Archimedes screw design, which is very interesting because it's based around a pump design that actually used to use in ancient Egypt to get like water out of the Nile. And they have now sort of rethought that design into a tidal turbine design, which is really interesting. But again, it's quite an out there technology. It's not exactly the common solution. And then another sort of a bit more unusual one is the tidal kite, where you tether this sort of, basically looks like a propeller plane, and you increase the energy yield you get by basically forcing the kite to move in the sort of shape of an 8, and that increases the relative velocity of the turbine, which is attached to the kite. And by increasing that velocity, you get more power. So it's a concept that's being developed, but it's definitely the more unusual one. So yeah, so as I said, there's definitely a sign that this is a less mature industry, because while it's really great to have all this innovation, it does make it impossible to have economies of scale. So it's driving up the fact that there's no convergence in terms of the design. It means that supply chain costs are going up a lot for tidal. So yeah, so that's kind of one of the reasons why tidal is more expensive than wind. So as I said, the horizontal axis and the vertical axis turbines are the most common ones. And again, they have very close equivalents in the wind industry. I mean, the vertical axis ones, they look basically exactly the same. And the mechanism of energy extraction is exactly the same. And that's actually really beneficial for the tidal power, because they effectively benefit from the wind industry being so mature. And so they learn a lot of technical know-how, and they basically gain a lot of experience from wind turbine design that can be directly applicable to tidal turbines. But the question remains then, why then is wind so developed, and why is tidal turbine industry not so developed? So there are challenges that are definitely unique to tidal power, and that is slightly preventing them from really taking off in a big way at the moment. So obviously the difference between wind and tidal is that the working fluid is water instead of air. And of course, water is 100 times denser than air, not 800 times denser than air, and which means that it has much higher energy density. So if you imagine carrying around a bucket of 10 liters of water, that's going to take a lot more effort than carrying around a bucket of 10 liters of air. So that's kind of what I mean by energy density. And this means that tidal turbines can actually be smaller than wind turbines and still produce the same amount of power. So this picture here shows a typical 1 megawatt wind blade in green and compares that to a typical 1 megawatt tidal turbine blade in blue. So you can see it's a lot smaller. So, you could think of it as like, oh, that's good, because then you can build smaller devices and that should cost less. That's actually not true, because also tidal turbines need much more expensive materials than wind turbines. And I'll talk about why that is just now. Because the other thing about tidal turbines is that they experience much, much larger forces than wind turbines. And you can see that by taking a very simple relationship, which is that power is equal to flow velocity times the thrust force acting on the turbine. That's just like a sort of simple shorthand way of estimating how much power is coming from the turbine and how much forces are acting on the turbine. And velocity if you think about a device that's going to produce the same amount of power, The velocity in air you can take as in sort of as a typical, it would be like 12 meters a second, whereas your typical tidal velocity would be 2.5 meters a second. So this means that to achieve the same power, the tidal device experiences a huge amount of thrust force just on the device. And you can see that on this graph to the right. So this is sort of over a period of time, an example of how much thrust force a wind turbine rotor is experiencing in black, and then comparing that to how much thrust force an equivalent tidal rotor is experiencing over the same amount of time. And you can see it's like 8 times the amount of power, thrust, I mean. This is actually about equivalent to the amount of thrust that comes from like a modern day jet engine. So imagine tying a jet engine to the ground and preventing it from taking off. That's how much forces is acting on a tidal turbine at any given time. So you need really expensive materials to make turbines that can withstand that kind of force. You need to use composites rather than, for wind turbines, you can use glass fiber, but for tidal turbines, you do need composite metals. So that's a pretty big problem, and it's even worse when the flow is turbulent. So turbulent flow is probably something that you experience on airplanes. You enter in a region of gusty flow, your airplane starts shaking. Exactly the same thing happens underwater. And you can basically think of it as just any local flow velocity that differs in any way from the local mean velocity. And that's actually a really big problem for tidal turbines, because turbulence causes just extreme variability in just the sort of local short-term inflow conditions. So this bottom left figure here shows a simulated example of the inflow signal in velocity that's seen by a tidal turbine. And as you can see, it's extremely variable. Even though the mean is about 1 meter a second, it's just extremely variable around that mean. So while this doesn't matter too much for the actual power extracted, it matters a lot for the loads on the turbine. Partially just because the thrust is larger. So, if you have a 10% variability in sort of 800 kilonewtons of thrust, that's a lot larger oscillating forces than if you only had 100 kilonewtons. But I also have a theory that the reason why this is more of an issue for tidal turbines than for wind turbines is also because tidal turbines are smaller. So if you imagine a large, slender wind turbine blade, if you have it's more likely that sort of turbulent gust events will be localized and only act over part of the blade, because the blade itself is so big. So you can have like some of this turbulence will just kind of cancel out on the blade. Whereas for a tidal turbine, because they are so large, so small, and because turbulence events in the oceans are so large, you get a lot of these unsteady events that are just envelop the blade, and that is my belief that that's also why it's more difficult for tidal turbines to operate in turbulence. So that causes a lot of problems for tidal turbines. Turbulence causes big problems, not just because they cause very large loads, but also because they're very difficult to model those loads. So turbulence is sort of famously difficult and complex to model, because turbulence exists over a very wide range of scales. Turbulence events can be hundreds of meters in size, or it can be in centimeters of size, and it can be anywhere in between. Just to model that whole complexity is extremely expensive, and it's really difficult to simulate. We also don't have very good models for correlation between turbulence and the loads acting on the turbine. It's not just as simple as sort of, your flow increases by 10%, so the loads increase by 10%. It's not that simple. So we don't have good predictive models of what turbulence actually does to a turbine. This is by the way, my research area. And we also don't have enough, because there aren't that many devices, there aren't enough experimental data to really make probabilistic predictions. So the solution at the moment is just to make the turbines really, really thick, and just put them in and hope that it works a little bit. It's like, I'm being a little bit sort of silly, but that's kind of part of the design motivation here. So you can see these sort of 3 turbine examples on the right. If you look at sort of the thickness of those blades, they're all absolutely massive. And part of that is just the safety factor that's needed in order to get these turbines to survive. And that is a bit of an issue if you want to have a competitive source of power that can compete with wind, because if you're designing for survivability instead of efficiency in power production, that, the cost of energy is going to go up. So that is an issue. There are a few other issues related to survivability. Biofouling, which you can see very exemplified by this sort of all the stuff that's grown on this sort of measuring buoy. That's a big problem for anything that you built underwater that needs to have moving parts and function over a long period of time. Obviously, you need to build so that you don't corrode in the water. So because of all of these sort of reliability and survivability issues and the biofouling thing, tidal turbines need a lot of maintenance. And if you think about it, how do you maintain a tidal turbine? They're underwater. How do you even see if a tidal turbine needs maintenance? They're underwater. With wind turbines, you can at least you can go and inspect them and see them. But for a tidal turbine, you actually have to take the turbine out of the water to clean it and to check in it and maintain it regularly. So that's a huge operational expense for tidal turbines, and is sort of contributing a lot to tidal power sort of cost of energy to have to do that. So that's one of the major obstacles, I think, for sort of cost competitiveness of tidal. One really interesting solution that has been proposed for this is to have, once again, floating platforms. So just like for wind turbines, floating platform was sort of hailed as this sort of key technology. Floating tidal turbines have been proposed and indeed implemented as a solution to solve this accessibility issue and this issue of sort of the constant need for maintenance. So this is an example of a floating platform tidal turbine. This is sort of a model prototype scale device where you see that we got these sort of floating things, and then you have these small tidal turbines that can basically be lifted out of the water and then down again, and that just makes maintenance way easier and cheaper. So it has a lot of advantages, this floating platform. So obviously accessibility is the main advantage, but you also actually get a bit of an advantage because the fastest flows in a tide happen near the surface rather than at the bottom of the ocean. So, and as I said, power increases with velocity to the power of 3. So actually, if you can get to the faster flows, that's actually a big benefit in terms of power as well. And also, because they're floating, you actually don't have to build these big intrusive structures on the sort of ocean floor, which is very expensive and very intrusive and kind of more environmentally impactful. You can just tether these with chains to the ground, and and then you can go to much deeper depths as well. So it has a lot of sort of practical benefits, this technology. So this is obviously a very small one. This is just something I wanted to quickly show you. This is a much, much larger one. This is a sort of industrial prototype, I guess, still, that was deployed almost exactly 2 weeks ago now. This is currently the most powerful tidal turbine in the world. It has 2 1-megawatt turbines that are each 20 meters in diameter. This is the floating platform. It's the O2 floating platform turbine developed by Orbital Marine Power. I just think it looks really cool. Here is being deployed a couple of weeks ago, and it's currently being tested. And I just wanted to show you because I think it looks great, and I think this is a really interesting technology going forward in terms of enabling tidal power to become cost competitive. So this is one to watch, I think. But of course, floating platforms do come with significant challenges. Once again, platform movement is a big deal. If the platform moves, the turbines will move, and that will again give rise to those oscillating loads. And they are actually, simulations would indicate that those loads are actually really large for a tidal turbine that's sort of moving back and up and down or something like that. So that's, from a survivability perspective, that could be a really big issue. The other thing is surface waves. When you're closer to the surface, surface waves will cause the same thing of unsteady loading, which will reduce the lifetime of the turbine, or can reduce it. So while floating platforms will reduce the need for maintenance, they might also, the other way around. While floating platforms will sort of increase the accessibility for maintenance and reduce the cost of maintenance, they might also increase the need for maintenance and even potentially reduce the turbine lifetime. But again, we don't have good predictive models for this. So I think really time will tell whether this will be a cheaper solution than normal bottom mounted turbines. I think that's really interesting and something that I'm definitely sort of watching going forward. So as I mentioned a few times, cost is really the main driver for widespread implementation of most sort of new renewables technologies. And so while sort of things like wind and solar is now pretty much cost competitive with sort of fossil fuels, which is what this figure shows, both wave and tidal stream energy is still sort of hovering up here and is still not quite competitive and expensive. The thing about tidal is that because it is fully predictable and can be a fully predictable baseload energy, that extra cost might be worth it, at least in some applications. So I mean, long term, it might not be as much of an issue. However, for tidal power, the single largest factor affecting affordability or the cost of energy is actually energy yield, like how much power you're getting out of a device. And here, in the long term, tidal might actually have a really big advantage over other renewables, even over wind. And that's because of something called the blockage effect. That is something that's unique to, or quite unique to tidal power. So if you again consider the difference between the wind turbine and the tidal turbine, a wind turbine will operate in the open air, right? Whereas a tidal turbine will operate in a constrained flow that is constrained by the surface of the sea and even the width of the channel it is in. And this means that the tidal turbine operates in something called a blocked flow. And this can actually be exploited, something called the blockage effect, in order to increase the power yield of the turbine substantially. And I'll just explain quickly why that is. So if you think about, this is a very simplified explanation of how wind and tidal turbines extract power from the flow. So this is just a sort of simple sketch of a wind turbine. It extracts power from the particles in the fluid. So, fluid particles are moving through the turbine and the turbine is extracting energy from those particles. But by extracting energy from those particles, it's effectively applying a type of resistance from the flow. It's almost like the more power it takes out, the more it starts to act like a wall to the flow. And that means the flow doesn't actually want to go through the turbine. So if the fluid particles if there's too much resistance being caused by the turbine, they will just move around the turbine. And then you won't get any energy from it. And because of this effect, a wind turbine has an upper limit of the maximum amount of energy that it can extract, and that's 59% efficiency. That is the theoretical maximum. A real turbine will extract less than that, sort of in the 40s range, but that's the maximum theoretical efficiency. Now, if you think about the other sort of extreme of that, you can think about a hydro turbine, which is completely enveloped by a wall in a pipe. And at that point, the fluid particles have to go through the turbine. They are forced to move through the surface area of the turbine. And that means that you can actually far exceed this 59% efficiency thing for that wind turbines has. So you can get more energy for that. Now, a tidal turbine is actually somewhere in between a wind turbine and a hydro turbine, because it's partially contained and partially sort of constrained by the channel. So because the fluid particles going through a channel have this partial constraint, they are slightly forced to go through the tidal turbine. You can actually increase the power yield quite substantially from the tidal turbine. And you can do this either by putting it in a channel with a blockage, or by putting two tidal turbines very close to each other. And that forces the fluid to go through the turbine. And that increases. So in simulations, you've even found efficiencies sort of over 85%, which is a huge, that's almost twice as much as sort of a conventional wind turbine. And that would be a game changer if that can be implemented in a large scale for a tidal farm. So of course, this is kind of not realistic at the moment. This is a future vision for tidal. It's very theoretical. At the moment, the largest tidal site in the world has 3 turbines. That's not enough to exploit this effect. But for the same site, they've received permission to build another 50 turbines. So maybe this is forthcoming. So this would be sort of like a future vision for large-scale implementation of tidal, of having these large farms that exploit the blockage effect such that their power production is much higher than that of sort of an equivalent wind farm. So that's partly why a tidal technology could be very interesting going forward and could contribute a lot to the energy sort of diversity in the UK. To summarize, this is just a summary. Tidal power is not quite yet competitive, but that might not matter because of its predictability and because of this sort of blockage effect that we can exploit. So very quickly, I'm just going to go through wave energy quickly, partly because this is not really my expertise or the expertise of the other people in my group, but also because wave energy is probably the least developed and the least ready for the large scale production of the other renewables. So that's why I'm not spending as much time on this one. So wave energy, interestingly, has attracted more investments historically than tidal power. It's just this thing, I think, that sort of wave energy seems to be really resonant with people. It's very easy to look at the sea and you see the waves and you think, oh, that looks like a lot of energy. What if we could harness that? So it really resonates with people. But it's still lagging behind tidal power in terms of development. So there's definitely some unique challenges to wave power that's making it more difficult to develop on a large scale than tidal power. So we're going to look at why that might be. So one very key interesting complexity about wave power compared to wind and tidal is that waves don't actually transport fluid particles, they transport energy. So you can see this really clearly on this really interesting video here, where you got the waves moving through, but the actual particles in the flow are actually just kind of doing this sort of small rotational motion in a quite stationary manner. So we extract energy through the fluid particles. So wave devices have to find a way to exploit this localized movement, whereas wind and tidal power can just translate the fluid particles moving directly into rotational motion. So immediately we have another level of complexity with wave power. And there are a large number of different designs have been proposed in order to exploit to translate this wave motion into some sort of rotational power to generate power from a turbine. Here are some of the more common ones. Absorbers will just bob up and down and use that sort of up and down motion and translate into rotational motion. And then we've got these attenuators, which have hinged parts that move up and down with the waves. So those are your kind of sort of more localized sort of small scale devices that you deploy out in the ocean. Then you can have these more sort of more large scale, almost like a bit more like infrastructure that look a bit like dams. Here's an example of an oscillating water column, which utilizes the rising and falling water to drive in this particular case, air moving up and down a tunnel with a turbine in. You can use that with the water as well. You can have the water move up and down through a turbine, so that would be fine too. You also have these overtopping devices that capture the water in a sense and then sort of let it run through a turbine. And these are obviously larger, you need quite large infrastructure investments to achieve that. And once again, you have a situation of there's a lot of diversity, which is really interesting and a lot of fun ideas, but the lack of design consensus drive up the cost of the energy. Wave energy is caused by the wind, but it maintains power for longer than the wind. So from that perspective, it could be a good complement to wind energy in the sense that they are not completely correlated. They're a bit correlated, but not entirely. Unfortunately, waves are strongest and have the most energy very far offshore, which is not cost effective because cabling it back in is really expensive. But the accessible waves is still in the order of 22 gigawatts for the UK is what the estimates say. This map here shows like the sort of a distribution of the resource, and you can see that far out is by far the strongest waves, but that's really not accessible to us. So the problems really is still the cost of development and the reliability of the resource, much like for tidal turbines. Like tidal turbines, wave devices, we need regular maintenance. Biofouling is a problem, overloading is a problem. You also have to design for worst case scenarios where you have, you're extracting power from the means, like sort of your everyday wave, but you have to make sure that the device can survive large scale wave events and storms. So this design for robustness rather than efficiency can also sort of drive up costs a bit. But one solution for all this, in terms of the cost issue, it could actually be something like integrated platforms, which is very, I think an interesting development. So this is a combined floating wind platform that also has 10 wave energy devices on it. And obviously this does save on costs because you can sort of use a lot of common infrastructure. But I think actually the key value here for wave energy is the fact that you get a sort of stepping stone technology. So it's important to remember that wind energy had decades to develop onshore before it moved offshore. And so they had all that time to learn and to develop the product in a cheaper, more protective environment before moving offshore. Tidal power didn't have that, but they could learn from wind. Wave power didn't have anything like that. They had to go sort of straight offshore. And so they didn't really have any sort of stepping stone technology. So a thing like this, where you combine the platforms and just make the cost of it a little less intrusive, and combine it with other offshore renewables, could be one of those stepping stone technologies to develop wave further. There are other options for similar sort of stepping stone technologies. You could use sort of integrated sort of self-powered monitoring devices, which is what these two are examples of here. This, I think, is kind of a sort of weather monitoring device that's powered by wave power. This little thing here is a sort of fish farm monitoring device that's powered by waves. So there are these sort of small scale devices, and basically by targeting very specific applications instead of the wider UK economy need, you sort of forego the economy of scale arguments, but instead say, okay, we're going to develop devices for specific applications in order to develop our technology. And at that point, you basically, the diversity of the resource is a benefit rather than a hindrance at that point. Okay, so apologies for this having been a very long talk. This is my last slide, and I just wanted to say there are many engineering aspects of offshore marine technology that I haven't mentioned. Sort of deployment, infrastructure, sort of maintenance, supply vessels, cabling dynamics is a huge thing, and like and other things like that. This is an enormous sort of industry and research area. But I do hope that this talk has sort of sparked your interest in some of it. And I just want to also finalize by saying, don't be discouraged about offshore renewable technologies. There are a lot of engineering technical challenges, but none of these problems are unsolvable. And this is kind of, in a sense, what engineers do. You know, they sort of try seeing these problems and solving them in order to make sure that society can function. So don't be discouraged in that sense. So thank you very much for listening. And yeah, I'm happy to answer some questions now. I guess I'll leave this screen up. Yeah, apologies, I haven't left that much time for questions, but I'll try to go through some of them. I had some really interesting questions, and can I just say, if I don't answer your question, I'm sorry. I might have chosen not to answer it because I don't think it's my area of expertise, which means that I don't really feel like I should say anything about it, but I will try to answer some of these things. I had a few questions about the role of energy storage, like batteries, and things like that, and like what kind of role that might play. And I think, as I mentioned a few times, I think that batteries are absolutely, or some sort of energy storage is absolutely necessary for a future reliance on intermittent renewables. And I think a lot of people are recognizing this, and there's a lot of sort of research and development going into battery technology. But they're not quite at the stage of development, I would say, as maybe wind power. So I think an interesting complexity here is that at the moment we're relying a lot on lithium-ion batteries for energy storage for wind power, and that's what they're doing in sort of like in Australia, and I know it's been implemented for some tidal projects as well. But the interesting thing about that is that lithium-ion batteries are not optimized for long-term energy storage like this. So it is currently the cheapest option, but only because it has such a large market for consumer electronics. It's not actually an optimized solution for long-term energy storage. So there are other battery technologies that are being developed that are really interesting. Like I've seen recently sort of liquid metal batteries, which are much more, you know, the whole thing where energy storage, you're not constrained by size. You can have something as large as you want, just as long as it's efficient. So basically there's the sort of, there's definitely potential for new battery technologies to come in and sort of corner that market. But at the moment, this is still sort of in development. I do think that will be really important for sort of an economy going forward and relying on intermittent renewables. Another interesting comment that someone was saying was sort of talking about the intersection of offshore renewables with like things like hydrogen, which is apparently instead of using battery storage and instead of using cabling so that you connect your offshore facility to onshore to transport electricity, you can instead convert your energy into basically chemical energy and chemical storage by making hydrogen. And that's a really interesting option for when you go further and further offshore, because at that point the cable costs will be huge. But that always needs to be balanced by the fact that you lose a bit of, efficiency when you transform something into chemical storage. So that will always be like a cost trade-off of whether the cabling or the sort of energy transfer is the most costly for you. Let me see what other questions we have. Another question that I had, which is I had a lot of questions about the impact of offshore renewables on like marine life and things like that. Again, something that I'm not super qualified to answer, but some interesting aspects of that is obviously for wind turbines, bird strikes are a big deal, and something we talk a lot about. And a really interesting solution that's been proposed for that for offshore is to paint one of the turbine blades in a different color from the other two. Because that makes much more like a visually more sort of noticeable sort of shape as it moves through the air. And it's actually been shown that that does reduce the number of bird strikes. But obviously that's a technology that specifically works offshore, because if you did that to onshore wind turbines, then it would have the same effect on people and it would be much more visually intrusive. So yeah, it would, if you had a wind turbine with one blade painted like red, that would be much more visually intrusive to people. But because of that, you can use that offshore to reduce the number of bird strikes. So that's one interesting sort of technological aspect of that. In terms of tidal turbines, there's a lot of research going on in terms of how tidal turbines affect habitats and things like that, and whether there are like impact damage for sort of marine mammals and fish. And basically has not been observed. It's not really considered to be a big problem for tidal power. It seems like marine animals tend to avoid tidal turbines. But again, it's such a small scale deployment at this point, so it's hard to tell what's going to happen as we sort of increase deployment. Okay, I'm going to have a quick look at the Q&A box, and then I know I've run over completely, so I might not be able to answer very many of these. Yeah, some interesting comments about hydrogen still. Again, it's an option. The other option other than hydrogen is to use ammonia as a chemical storage thing. It's a bit easier because it's much easier to store ammonia than to store hydrogen. And also there's an existing market for ammonia, so it might be a sort of like a gateway chemical storage thing. But it's all a little bit sort of science fiction at the moment, so it's not really something that's, I think, is being implemented at a large scale at the moment. There's a lot of really good questions, and I'm kind of worried about answering some of them because I don't want to say something that's wrong. Because in the end, I am kind of limited in my expertise. So yeah, interesting thing of the cost of actually sort of getting the energy from the offshore device to onshore, and how that compares between sort of wind and tidal. So tidal has the benefit of you kind of have to be quite close to land to deploy it, because tidal power is greatly enhanced by building in sort of narrow channels, maybe between the mainland and an island or something like that. So you get these sort of, you basically get tidal channels, and that's kind of one of the primary sources of tidal power. So you're already quite close to shore, and that reduces the costs cabling quite a lot. And so for offshore wind, one of the big problems is actually that, you know, you want to go far out because that's where the big sort of the high winds are. But the cost of the sort of power cable to get the electricity in again is huge. That's one of the main costs associated. And so that's going to be a problem as we go further and further offshore. But yeah, as I mentioned, one of the options there is to include a method of chemical storage instead, and just transport that in and out, which might be cheaper. And it'll depend on how far offshore you're going and whether there's infrastructure to deal with the chemical energy storage and things like that. So I think there are technological options there, but I think, yeah, all the infrastructure might not be there yet. Yeah, another thing about infrastructure is we had some questions about like sort of onshore facilities for testing sort of wind turbine blades, which obviously is there will be a big need as it's sort of, yeah, so this is the final question, by the way, sorry. This is the final question. It's the need for onshore facilities to test blades before they're sort of deployed in the ocean. And there's definitely, like, the UK is actually really well placed here because the UK has really good offshore energy offshore in general infrastructure. So the UK is actually, the UK is very well placed to be a world leader in this field because there's a huge resource and there's a huge existing industrial infrastructure. So you need these big facilities that will test the wind turbine blades by basically bending them up and down. And doing that by that bending, they're effectively sort of simulating 20 years of lifetime by sort of trying to bend the blades until they break, basically, and to see that they can last that long, which is really great. But the problem when you're going further offshore, you're building larger and larger turbines, is that you need these enormous, like 100, 200 meter blades. You know, to find a warehouse or to find like a sort of a site that can do that. And as well has the power capacity to bend a sort of 100-meter long blade several times over and over again. That's a big sort of space requirement, a lot of power requirement. But the UK has really good existing infrastructure for that. So I'm quite hopeful about that. Okay, sorry, that's it. I won't answer any more questions, I'm sorry. And we can wrap up now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Amanda. It was absolutely fascinating. I mean, there's so many questions I'm sure people have around all of this, but as I said to everyone out there, she is a force of nature, if that's an appropriate analogy to use in terms of the context of our discussion. And I'm sure we look forward to having her here for her research fellowship. And indeed, it's going to be fascinating taking forward these discussions. And I'm sure you all enjoyed that. And I hope you all have a very good evening or afternoon or morning, wherever you are on the planet. Thank you so much for joining us. And I hope that you will also continue to join us for our series of academic lectures and also for our celebration of 100 years of women graduating at Oxford University. And in that context, we'll be having another very interesting event on May the 18th, when we have our senior tutor, Professor Roy Westbrook, former Vice Principal of the College, and student Lucy Warm interview and in conversation with our Honorary Fellow and alumna of the College, Professor Dame Jane Glover, the renowned musicologist and conductor. And we're very, very proud of Jane, and I'm sure her reflections on her career and her achievement and the challenges will be something which you'll all thoroughly enjoy. So until then, and again, many, many thanks to all of you. Take care. And again, to you, Amanda, again, I'm very, very grateful to you for showing off the wonderful academics that we have at this college. Thank you and good evening.